There are a lot of very smart, very capable executives in local government who don't last. They don't flame out publicly. They don't always fail in some obvious way. Sometimes they just disappear. They stall, they plateau, they quietly move on or get pushed out. And it's usually not because they weren't good at their job. It's because they were playing by a set of rules that no longer exist. Nowhere is this more visible than in the city manager role. In this episode, I'm going to break down the real reasons local government leaders struggle to last in this profession and what you need to do differently if you want to build a career that actually holds up over time. Welcome to Gov360, your full circle view on local government leadership. And now, the most watched local government podcast in America. This is the show for local government professionals who want to lead with impact, master their craft, and rise to the top of the profession. And today's episode, well, this one matters. Because while we're going to focus on city managers, this applies to just about everyone in local government. It doesn't matter if you're an analyst just getting started, a department head, an assistant city manager, or already sitting in the top seat. If you want to lead and you want to stay in this profession long enough to make real impact, you need to understand what's changed, because something has changed. There is not a more visible example of what's happening in this profession than what we've been seeing in the city manager role. The pressure is higher. The expectations are different. The margin of error is smaller. But the patterns we're going to talk about today show up at every level of local government leadership. Let's slow this down for a minute and really unpack what's changed, because I think this is where a lot of people in local government get tripped up. There was a time when success in the profession followed a very predictable path. You built your technical skills, you learned the processes, you became reliable, you delivered results, and over time that translated into trust, stability, and career longevity. That model worked because the environment itself was relatively stable. Councils didn't turn over as frequently. Issues moved at a slower pace. Public engagement was more limited and more predictable. And frankly, there was more patience built into the system. You had time to build credibility. You had time to recover from mistakes. You had time to grow into the role. That is not the environment today. Today, the timeline is compressed. You don't have years to build trust. You often have months, sometimes weeks, to establish credibility. Public perception is formed quickly, and once it's formed, it sticks. Social media amplifies small issues into larger narratives. And with the rise of term limits and the over-politicization of everything, governing bodies are changing faster, which means expectations are constantly shifting. So what happens? You have leaders who are doing the same things that worked for the last generation, but the environment they're operating in has fundamentally changed. And that creates a gap between what they think should work and what actually works. And over time, that gap becomes friction. And eventually, that friction becomes pressure. And if it's not addressed, that's when you start to see careers stall or end. So what we're going to do is break down the specific ways that gap shows up, the mistakes public executives commonly make that lead them to being exposed. Mistake number one, overvaluing competence. This is probably the hardest one for people in this profession to accept. Local government attracts people who are highly capable, people who are detail-oriented, people who take pride in getting things right, people who care about doing the job well. So naturally, the assumption becomes, if I just do excellent work, that will carry me. And again, that used to be much closer to the truth. But today, competence is the floor, not the ceiling. Let me give you an example of how this shows up. You can have a city manager who delivers a balanced budget, improves service levels, and keeps operations running smoothly. But if the council feels disconnected from that process, or doesn't feel heard, or doesn't feel aligned, those outcomes don't carry the same weight. Now, contrast that with someone who may not be perfect technically, but is constantly communicating, aligning, checking in, and making people feel part of the process. That person often has more staying power. That's the shift. It's not that competence doesn't matter. It's that competence alone is not enough to sustain trust. This is an area where I've had to adapt in my own career. I have a strong leadership style. I'm a firm believer in the council-manager form of government and in respecting the appropriate roles of the council versus the executive function within that system. As such, my tendency had been to move quickly to implement policy and to unilaterally make decisions about day-to-day operations. And while that approach may be technically correct within the council-manager model, I learned the hard way that it can also cause some members of the council to feel left out of the process. Right or wrong, they felt that I was moving the organization on my own and leaving them behind, which was certainly not my intention. So what do you do about that? First, you have to start thinking about how your work is experienced, not just what the work is. Ask yourself, do people understand the why behind my decisions? Do they feel included in the process? Do they trust my judgment, even when they disagree? Second, you need to elevate your communication cadence. Not just formal presentations, but ongoing alignment, regular check-ins, proactive updates, clarity before confusion sets in. Third, you need to develop judgment under uncertainty, because at higher levels, there is rarely a perfect answer. There are trade-offs, and people are evaluating not just the outcome, but how you think through those trade-offs. If you want to go deeper on this concept, I break it down in more detail in episode 20 titled, Competence is No Longer Enough. But the key takeaway is this: competence gets you in the role. Everything else determines whether you stay. Mistake number 2, misreading the political environment. This is where a lot of careers get derailed quickly, because many professionals come into leadership roles with the mindset that I'm here to implement policy, not engage in politics. And at a high level, that's correct. But in practice, it's incomplete, because every policy decision exists within a political context. Every issue has stakeholders. Every stakeholder has interests. Every interest creates pressure. And if you're not actively mapping that out, you're operating without full information. Let me give you a practical way to think about this. Before making a major recommendation or decision, ask, who cares about this? Why do they care? What are the potential points of resistance? Where is alignment? And where is tension? That's not politics in a negative sense. That's situational awareness. Another key mistake here is assuming neutrality protects you. It does not. In some cases, neutrality creates ambiguity, and ambiguity invites interpretation. People start filling in the gaps, and often they don't fill them in your favor. So what's the adjustment? You need to become explicit in your thinking. Not political, but clear. Here's how I'm evaluating this. Here are the trade-offs. Here's why I'm recommending this approach. That clarity builds confidence. I go deeper into this dynamic in episode 21 titled, Is the Council Manager Form of Government Buckling in Today's Politicized Era? But the short version is this. You don't need to play politics, but you absolutely need to understand the political environment, because if you don't, it will shape outcomes around you. Mistake number 3, neglecting relationships. Let's expand on relationships, because this is where a lot of leaders unintentionally fall short. They focus heavily on tasks and not enough on people. They assume relationships will develop naturally over time. But at the executive level, that is not enough. Relationships need to be built intentionally, early, consistently, and strategically. Let's start with the governing body. One of the most important things you can do is understand each council member individually, not just their positions on issues, but how they think. Are they detail-oriented or big picture? Do they want frequent communication or periodic updates? What are their priorities? What pressures are they facing? That understanding allows you to communicate in a way that resonates. It reduces friction. It builds alignment. In one city that I managed, my predecessor lost his job for this very reason. He maintained excellent relationships with the majority of the council, but let his relationships lapse with members of the council he didn't always see eye to eye with. He felt comfortable that he had sided with the majority until an election happened and the majority shifted. All of a sudden, he found himself in a position where the council members he had alienated controlled the majority voting bloc, and he quickly found himself out of a job. Now let's talk about your internal team. If your executive team is not aligned, that instability will show up externally. So you need to invest time there as well. Clarity of expectations, open communication, trust within the team. And then there's the broader organization. People are always watching leadership. They're reading signals, and your consistency or inconsistency shapes culture more than anything else. The practical takeaway here is simple. Don't wait until you need relationships to build them. By then, it's too late. Mistake number 4, failing to manage your narrative. Most city managers don't think in terms of narrative. They think in terms of operations, budgets, projects, deliverables. But leadership today requires both, because people don't just evaluate outcomes. They interpret them. They assign meaning to them. And if you're not helping shape that meaning, someone else will. So what does it mean to manage your narrative? It means being intentional about how you show up. It means reinforcing key messages consistently. It means explaining not just what is happening, but why it matters. Let me give you a practical example. If your city is making a difficult budget decision, you can either present it as a technical adjustment, or you can frame it within a broader story about long-term sustainability, fiscal responsibility, and protecting core services. Same decision, different narrative, very different reception. So how do you apply this? 3 things: consistency, clarity, repetition. You don't say something once and assume it lands. You reinforce it over time. That's how narrative takes hold. Mistake number 5, no personal strategy. Personal strategy is where a lot of leaders lose direction because the job is demanding. It's easy to get consumed by the day-to-day, and when that happens, you stop being intentional. You stop thinking about where you're going, and you start reacting to what's in front of you. Leaders who last create space to think. They periodically step back and ask, what am I building? What kind of leader do I want to be? In what environments do I thrive? And just as important, what environments don't fit me well? That level of self-awareness matters because not every situation is the right fit, and staying in the wrong situation too long can shorten your career just as much as anything else. So be intentional. Make decisions that align with your long-term direction. Don't just manage the job, manage your career. Let me bring this all together. If you step back and look at everything we just talked about, this isn't really about 5 separate mistakes. It's about one underlying issue, and that is this. A lot of people in this profession are operating with an outdated understanding of what leadership requires. They're doing what worked before. They're doing what they were trained to do. They're doing what, on paper, should work. But the environment has changed, and if you don't adjust to that, you can find yourself in a situation where you're doing everything right and still struggling, still vulnerable. That's a frustrating place to be because it doesn't make sense at first. But once you understand the shift, it starts to click. You realize that leadership today is not just about competence. It's about awareness. It's about relationships. It's about communication. It's about being intentional in how you show up and how you lead. And here's the part I want to leave you with. This is not about becoming someone you're not. It's not about being political. It's not about being performative. It's about being more complete as a leader. It's about expanding your skill set to match the reality of the environment you're in. Because if you do that, you don't just last longer. You lead more effectively. You create more stability. You build more trust. And ultimately, you have a greater impact. If issues like these are things you find yourself thinking about, if you're trying to navigate these challenges in your own career, I'm preparing to launch something that I think you're going to be excited about. I know I am. Now, some have reached out to me recently and have commented that they've noticed I've been dropping episodes every 3 or 4 weeks instead of every 2 weeks like I'd have in the past. And that's because I've been busy working on something big. With Gov.23 having reached its 1-year anniversary, I've paused to consider the lessons of this journey over the past year. Probably my biggest takeaway, and frankly surprise, has been the degree to which public sector professionals across the country and even the globe are struggling with the emotional aspect of the work. It is a challenging time to be in local government. The work takes an emotional toll, and it can be incredibly isolating. While there are lots of places to go for technical training, no one is openly talking about the personal cost, how to navigate challenging councils, public outrage, toxic political environments, the spread of misinformation and disinformation on social media, which has led to erosion of trust in public institutions everywhere. So many professionals have reached out over the past year, seeking connection, seeking community, seeking to feel not so alone. Local government is a public profession, but the people in it need a private space to have real conversations and real connection. And that's exactly why I'm building the Gov360 community on Patreon. This will be a private, safe space where local government leaders can come together, support one another, and go deeper on the most pressing issues facing this profession. A place for more candid conversations, a place to talk through real-world situations and how to approach them. Because the reality is, some of the most important conversations in local government can't always happen in public. There needs to be a space for honest, thoughtful discussion. Beyond that, there will also be exclusive content, behind-the-scenes footage, studio tours, early access to select episodes before they're released publicly, and live discussions with me and other leaders in the profession. So if that's something that resonates with you, keep an eye out. The Gov360 community on Patreon is coming very soon. If you found value in today's episode, consider sharing it with a friend or colleague. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching and listening. Thank you for joining me on this meaningful journey. And thank you for making Gov360 the most watched local government podcast in America. Until next time, govern boldly, my friends.